Stephanie. I'm here to read you another story. It's time for Story Time with Stephanie. And I know that you and your dad really love World War II. So do I. So I have a ton of World War II books. So today's story is called Air Raid, Pearl Harbor, The Attack That Stunned the World by Theodore Taylor. So I'm going to read you a chapter from this book. I like this book because it talks about both what the Japanese were thinking and the events that led up to World War II and caused the Japanese to attack, as well as some of the missed signals and missed opportunities that the United States had when they were before the attack happened. So, I'm going to read you this chapter. Attack, attack, attack. That mysterious thing in the hills, the electronic device that caused gossip back in November, was operating this morning. It was atop a secret British invention called radar. Set on mobile platforms so that it could be moved from place to place, the device was a sort of electronic eye that could look far out over the seas and onto the skies. 5 such radar stations were located around the island, and when working, they could pick up an aircraft 150 miles away. The unit sent out a beam, and when an object interrupted the beam, a blip, a small mark appeared on a glass tube or scope, rather like the later television tube. Telephone lines ran directly from these mobile radar stations to the Combat Information Center at Fort Schaffner. When an operator saw an incoming or outgoing aircraft or ship on his radar scope, he immediately informed Fort Schaffner, and the target was plotted on the boards. Experts decided whether the aircraft of the ship was friendly or enemy. If they thought it was the latter, they issued an alert. The Opana mobile radar station on a high ridge near Kahuku Point on the north end of Oahu was always manned between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. General Short believed this period was the most likely time for an enemy attack. Like almost 3 weeks, Army privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott hastily trained for radar operations, but by no means were experts on the amazing new apparatus. They had the lonely duty at Opana. They were there to spot aircraft and report them to Fort Schaffner, but everyone saw the job as training more than anything else. So far, they had had no enemy sighting to report. This morning, the 2 men awakened at 3:45. They had the radar warmed up and working by 4 a.m. sharp. Only now, at 6:45 a.m., did they see anything on the scope. They reported several planes approaching from the northeast, more than 100 miles out. These were probably reconnaissance seaplanes launched from the Tone and the Chikauma, which were both Japanese fighter ships. But the duty officer at the information center at Fort Schaffner, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, made nothing of the report. In fact, Lockhart and Elliott were advised to secure the set and shut it down. 15 minutes later, the information center was practically deserted. Everyone except Tyler had gone off to breakfast. He still had 1 hour of duty left, and then the center would close down until the next morning. Tyler was an Army Air Corps pilot, and this radar duty was simply additional training for him. It was rather boring, too. Back at Opana, Lockhart and Elliott were waiting for the breakfast truck to come rolling up their ridge, and to while away the time, they decided to keep the radar set in operation. Elliott, who had the least experience, was at the dials when a large blip showed up on the scanner. It was so large that Lockhart thought the radar set must be out of order. He sat down at the dials. No, they seemed to be working all right, although they had constant trouble with it. Like any other new apparatus, especially a sensitive electronic gadget, it had occasional problems. But the system was certainly working okay now. As Lockhart read off the distance and direction, Elliott plotted the blips. The blips were 137 miles away, to the northeast. larger than either Lockhart or Elliott had ever seen on the scope. Dozens of planes! At 7:06 a.m., an excited Private Elliott called Fort Schaffner, getting through to Private McDonald, the switchboard operator. McDonald listened, scribbled down the information, and took it to Lieutenant Tyler, who was waiting only for the clock hands to settle at 8 o'clock so that he could go home. Tyler was not at all disturbed by the large image on Opanya's scope, and McDonald called Lockhart to tell him that the lieutenant wasn't concerned. Bugs in the equipment was the obvious answer, he thought. The blips were bigger than ever. Lockhart reported, and they were closing in rapidly. At 7:15 a.m., he estimated that they were only 92 miles away. Again, Private Lockhart attempted to impress Lieutenant Tyler. He requested to talk personally to him. Tyler picked up the phone and listened to Lockhart, but he decided the planes must be friendly. He knew the Navy carriers were out on operations, and it was possible that some Army aircraft were arriving as well. KGMB had stayed on the air all night, usually an indication of an incoming overseas flight. "Don't worry about it," Tyler finally told Lockhart. But the breakfast truck still hadn't arrived, and the two young privates continued to watch the blips as they became ever closer. And by 7:39 a.m., they were 22 miles off the island of Oahu. Lieutenant Outerbridge of the USS Ward had sent 2 messages off the 14th Naval District headquarters, but they were in code, so it took a few minutes to decode them. So it wasn't until 7:12 a.m. did Duty Officer Lieutenant Commander Harold Kamansky see the startling slips of paper. He immediately called Captain John Earl, Chief of Staff to the Commander of the Naval District, Admiral Claude Block. Almost 30 minutes had passed while Earl and Block conferred this report from Outerbridge. Both officers were surprised, to put it mildly. Depth bombing a submarine almost at the edge of the harbor? Surprising, if not stunning news. There had been a number of sub sightings within the past few months, not many of them confirmed, and it wasn't clear in the minds of either Earl or Block that Outerbridge actually saw the submarine that he claimed to have sunk. They wanted positive confirmation, and so they informed Commander Kamansky. It was now 7:40 a.m., only 1 minute after Opanya Radar had established that the planes were 22 miles away. The phone rang in Admiral Kimmel's quarters in Makalupa, a housing area on the high grounds of Pearl Harbor that afforded a good view of Battleship Row. Kimmel was told of the Ward's action, canceled his golf date with General Short, and prepared to go to his headquarters at the sub-base to investigate the details of the claimed sinking. At about this moment, Lieutenant Commander Fushida, this is Japan now, leading the 48 Nakajima B-5N1 high-level bombers, each carrying a 1,600-pound armor-piercing converted naval shell, looked down through the hole in the clouds. He saw a long, tumbling line of surf that pounded along the north coast of Oahu. The navigation had been good. He was over Kakuo Point. He couldn't have asked for better weather. Even the 10-knot wind from the north aided him. There were heavy clouds around the mountain peaks east and west of Pearl Harbor, but the weather report indicated only scattered clouds over Pearl Harbor itself. He had been listening to the station KGMB. In fact, only moments ago, he had made a navigational change to home in on the broadcast beam. Spread out in the skies around, below, and above him flew the strike force. To his right, at a lower altitude, was Lieutenant Commander Marata and his 40 Nakajima 97 Kate torpedo planes. To his left, Lieutenant Commander Takahashi's 51 Ayashi dive bombers carrying 500-pound bombs. Above the bombers and torpedo planes, watchful for any arising American aircraft, the 43 Mitsubishi Zero or Ziki fighters were flying protection. They were ready to respond to the orders of Lieutenant Commander Itiya, who'd had the honor earlier that morning of being the first pilot off Akagi. They drummed on through the broken clouds. No other aircraft flew in sight. Actually, a few civilian planes were aloft, But except for the oncoming B-17 flight from California, no Army aircraft were up. The Marine planes were all still on the ground at Iwa Field this morning, and a few Navy patrol bombers on duty were routinely scanning sea areas at various distances from Oahu. Yet Fushida was still not certain that the Americans were truly asleep down there, and had no knowledge of his presence in the sky. The scout planes from Tone and Chikuma, whose job was to report on enemy air defense, had been silent. Nonetheless, at about 7:40 a.m., it was time to make a decision. Time to deploy his aircraft. He'd been given two plans, one to activate if surprise was achieved, and the other in case surprise was lost. In case of the latter, the dive bombers and fighters would hit the airfields and anti-aircraft defenses first, then the torpedo planes would come in when the resistance lessened. Fukushima believed surprise had been achieved, and so he slid open his cockpit canopy. He fired a visual signal with a pistol flare, one black dragon. It meant the torpedo planes would go in first and hit the major ships. Then his own horizontal bombers would attack, and finally the dive bombers. It was Genda's careful planning tactic. Commander Murata saw one black dragon signal and started his torpedo group down the lower altitude. The dive bombers began to climb to 12,000 feet. Yoshida's own group would fly at 3,500 feet for the horizontal bomb runs, but the fighters above them did not seem to be responding to the signal, so Fushida fired a second shot from the flare pistol. Although Fushida meant simply to arouse Commander Itiya and his Zeros, the dive bomber pilots took the signal to mean two black dragons or surprise is lost. Now, as the planes proceeded along the coast to a southwesterly direction, confusion reigned in the formation as the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers headed for a simultaneous instead of a separate attack. Some civilians, and undoubtedly some military personnel, saw the aircraft in the sky along the coastline between Kuhaku Point and Kina Point. But though they wondered about the large numbers, they weren't alarmed. They decided the Army and the Navy must be exercising, although such an activity was unusual for a Sunday. None of the planes were close enough to reveal the red meatballs, Japanese flag insignia, on their fuselages. At 7:49 a.m., when the formation split up nearly opposite Walua Bay, Fushida turned to his radio operator, Warrant Officer Muziki, and ordered an attack. Muziki hit his Morse code key. Toot-toot-toot-toot-toot! Attack! 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 The torpedo bombers swung inland to fly parallel to the Winey Range, en route to the naval base. The fighters and the dive bombers banked sharply across the island and hit the Wheeler Field and then Coney Naval Air Station. Fushida continued southeast into his level bombers. They cut across the land by Kana Point, and they flew on to orbit off Barber's Point to await the moment of their attack. There was still no sign of opposition from the ground. No fighter planes buzzed up from Wheeler or Iwa or Ford Island. No hidden guns let loose bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Fushida was amazed. 4 minutes later, he ordered Mizuka to radio a signal to Vice Admiral Nagumo and the rest of the task force 200 miles away, closer than they originally planned. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code transmission meant complete surprise has been achieved. Nagumo received this news without visible emotion, but certainly there was great relief amongst all the carriers. Admiral Yamamoto, who was aboard the Nagato in Japan's inland sea, also heard the signal. While monitoring the bands of the Nagato's radio room, it picked up Fushida's message. Like Nagumoto, Admiral Yamamoto displayed no motion, but asked the time of attack to be carefully checked. Fushida's signal meant that the other Japanese attacks throughout the Pacific and the Far East could now begin. The message from Hawaii came earlier than he had planned. Fushida was ahead of schedule. But at 7:53 a.m., the first bomb had yet to fall. The first bullets had not sprayed out of machine guns. Fushida's aircraft were roaring to their striking positions. Their main targets were battleships, Ford Islands and its naval base, and Wheeler and Hickam Fields. Some pilots were to split off the group and hit their other targets. Keough Naval Air Station, and the Marine Base at Iwo. Each pilot knew his primary targets. On the American ships, it was almost time for the colors. The morning flag rising ceremony. In Battleship Row, the USS California was moored by herself at the head of the row. Behind her, against the dock, was a fully loaded gasoline tanker, Neosho. Then, more big ones. The Oklahoma and the Massachusetts were together. The West Virginia and the Tennessee side by side, and the Arizona moored inside the repair ship Vestial. Finally, by herself at the end of the row, was the Nevada. The ships were tied to concrete quays, huge pilings offshore from the banks of Ford Island. Across the channel, almost directly opposite the California, the cruiser Helena was tied inboard of the old Olgala at the station's dock. The battleship Pennsylvania and the destroyers Cassin and Downs were in the Mammoth Naval Yard dry dock. At the dock at the Southeast Lock, opposite the subbase, sat the cruisers New Orleans, San Francisco, and Honolulu. 5 subs were in port. On the other side of Ford Island, 4 ships were tied to the deepwater mooring quays, the cruisers Detroit and Raleigh, the former battleship Utah, now a target vessel, and the seaplane tender Tangier. Spread out across the harbor in Middle Lock and East Lock at the other anchorages, destroyers nested together with support ships. More than 90 commissioned vessels were in the harbor, and all awaited the daily routine of the colors. Then, those personnel who were not on duty could relax. The next occasion of any kind of church call. After that, the chow down, which usually came between 11:30 and 12 o'clock. Sundays were lazy and quiet on the ships of the Pacific Fleet. At approximately 7:54 a.m., Admiral Kimmel, still in his quarters at Makalupa, was getting off the phone with yet another perplexing report from the destroyer Ward. Now she'd caught a sampan small fishing boat with Japanese writing on it in the defensive sea area. At the same minute, 7:54 a.m., General Short was at his quarters in Fort Schaffner. It was the last minute of peace. Well, I hope you like that, Quinn. This is the only picture in that chapter. These are all the ships that were in the bay. You can see that having all those ships so close together was not a very good idea. Well, we all know what happens next. Though, the next chapter is pretty good. Maybe I'll read that one to you, too. Until then, it was good seeing you. Love you, Quinn. Hopefully we'll see you soon.